The morning light filtered through the grime-caked window of my truck, casting everything in a sickly yellow hue. I killed the engine and sat there for a long moment, watching the sign sway in the breeze, a faded orange sunburst with black letters that read Sunset Motel, vacancy. Most of the neon had burned out years ago, leaving only the S and the L to flicker against the dawn. 16 years since I'd last set foot here. 16 years since I'd been left behind like a suitcase someone decided they didn't want to carry anymore. I forced my hands to release the steering wheel. They tingled with the pins and needles sensation of blood returning to cramped fingers. The drive from Portland had taken nearly 7 hours, and I'd stopped exactly twice, once for gas, once for coffee I couldn't taste. Every mile closer brought a tightness to my chest that I couldn't quite name. The parking lot was mostly empty. A rusted sedan sat in the far corner, covered in a tarp that had long since surrendered to the elements. Near the office, a late-model sedan gleamed in the morning light, its paint too perfect for this place. I didn't recognize either vehicle. I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat and stepped out. The air smelled of dust and pine and something faintly chemical, like bleach trying too hard to cover something else. The motel stretched out in a long, single-story U-shape, the exterior walls painted a pink that time had faded to the color of an old bruise. Room doors lined the walkway, each one a different shade of peeling paint. Room 7. That was the one. I could see it from where I stood, 3 doors down from the office. The door had been repainted at some point, a fresh coat of white that stood out against its neighbors. But it was the same door. I knew it the way you know a scar on your own body. "Can I help you?" The voice came from behind the office screen door, rough with age and suspicion. A woman stood there, silhouetted against the dim interior. She pushed the screen open and stepped onto the concrete walkway, squinting at me. Martha Sullivan. She looked older than I remembered, which was stupid, of course she did. The last time I'd seen her, she was in her early 60s, with dark hair streaked with gray and a back that still carried itself straight. Now her hair was completely white, thin in places, pulled back in a loose bun. The lines on her face had deepened into gullies, and she moved with a careful deliberation that suggested her joints had stories to tell. But her eyes were the same. Sharp. Watchful. The kind of eyes that had seen everything and judged most of it worthless. "It's me, Martha." My voice came out rougher than I'd intended. "Clara." She stopped halfway between the office and the parking lot. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stood there with her hands shoved into the pockets of a threadbare cardigan. A breeze tugged at her white hair, and she didn't bother to smooth it down. "Clara Bennett," she said finally. Not a question. A statement, like she was testing how the name tasted on her tongue. "I know I should have called first." "Yes. You should have." She crossed her arms, and the gesture reminded me of every lecture she'd ever given me, about homework, about curfew, about the company I kept. "You look tired." 7 hours on the road. "That's not what I meant." I shifted my weight, the duffel bag heavy against my hip. The morning was cool, but sweat had begun to bead at the back of my neck. I didn't know where else to go. Martha studied me for another long moment. Her eyes moved from my face to the truck, then back to the duffel bag hugged against my body. Whatever she saw must have satisfied something in her, because she let out a breath and nodded toward the office. "Come inside. I'll put coffee on." The office hadn't changed either. Same worn linoleum floor, same Formica counter with a bell for late-night arrivals, same corkboard covered in faded business cards and flyers for local attractions that had probably closed down years ago. A small television sat on the counter, broadcasting the local morning news with the sound turned low. Martha moved behind the counter with the practiced ease of someone who had performed the same movements thousands of times. She filled the coffee maker with water from a plastic jug, scooped grounds into the filter, and pressed the button. The machine wheezed to life. "Sit," she said, gesturing to one of 2 folding chairs set up near a space heater that looked older than I was. I sat. The chair groaned under my weight, and I set the duffel bag on the floor between my feet. Clara Bennett remains the central figure of this chapter. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, sending steam curling toward the water-stained ceiling tiles. I watched the brown liquid drip into the glass carafe, counting the drops as if they might measure something important: time, forgiveness, the weight of 16 years. Martha didn't speak while the coffee brewed. She busied herself with small movements, adjusting the carafe, straightening a stack of receipts held by a rusted clip, wiping the counter with a dish rag that had seen better days a decade ago. Her hands had the slight tremor of age, but each motion was deliberate, practiced, the economy of someone who had done these things 10,000 times. When the coffee finished, she poured 2 mugs and carried them to the folding chairs. She handed me one without ceremony, then lowered herself into the other with a soft grunt. "I don't have cream anymore," she said. "My doctor says no dairy. Black is fine." I wrapped my palms around the mug. The heat seeped into my cold fingers, a small mercy. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way she used to make it. Some things didn't change. Martha blew across the surface of her mug, watching me over the rim. Her eyes were the same pale blue I remembered, still sharp despite the web of wrinkles at their corners. She'd been in her late 50s when I left, or when I'd been taken, depending on how you looked at it. Now she was pushing 80, and it showed in the slope of her shoulders, the way her knuckles had swollen around the joints. "You look tired," she said finally. "I drove straight through." "From where?" "Portland." She nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something she'd already suspected. "That's a long drive. 7 hours if you take the coast route. 8 with traffic. Must be important, then. Coming all this way." The question hung between us, unanswered. I took a sip of coffee to buy time, but the bitterness sat on my tongue like an accusation. "I didn't know where else to go," I said. Martha's expression didn't change. If she was surprised by my honesty, she didn't show it. She just watched me with that patient, assessing gaze I remembered from childhood, the look that said, "I'll wait until you're ready." I'd never been ready. Not then. Not now. "Your room is still there," she said. "Number 7. I've kept it clean, in case you ever came back." My throat tightened. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She took another sip. "But I figured you might need a place to land." "Everyone needs a place to land eventually." The words hit harder than they should have. I looked down at the coffee mug, at the tiny chip on its rim, and blinked hard. "I don't know how long I'm staying," I said. "Or what I'm doing here, really. I stopped. How could I explain it? The restlessness that had been building for months, the feeling of living a life that didn't quite fit, the moment 3 days ago when I'd stood in my Portland apartment and realized I couldn't breathe there anymore. I'd packed a bag, called my landlord, and started driving east with no destination in mind. The Sunset Motel had been a reflex, a gravitational pull I hadn't known I still felt. "You don't have to explain," Martha said. "You're here. That's enough." It wasn't, and we both knew it. But I let the lie sit between us, warm and fragile as the coffee in my hands. We drank in silence for a while. The heater clicked on, humming against the cold seeping through the thin walls. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window in its frame. The sound was familiar, the same wind that had howled through this valley every winter of my childhood, carrying the smell of dry grass and dust. "Business still good?" I asked, nodding toward the parking lot. Martha snorted. "Good enough to keep the lights on. That's about all I can say for it. Only 2 cars out there. One of them's mine." "Who owns the other one?" Clara Bennett remains the central figure of this chapter. Martha disappeared into the back room, and I heard the thin rattle of keys against a metal ring. The sound carried me back 16 years, that same jangling noise when she'd first led me to room 7, a frightened 6-year-old clutching a worn duffel bag. I pressed my palms flat against the counter, feeling the grain of the wood, grounding myself in the present. She emerged holding a single brass key on a faded plastic tag. Number 7. The key was old, worn smooth at the edges, but the tag looked newer. Lock's been replaced, she said, sliding it across the counter. Had to, after the last guest tried to jimmy it. Still the same room, though. Same bed, same dresser, same view of the gravel lot. I picked up the key. It was warm from her hand. I'll only stay a night, I said, though the words tasted hollow. You'll stay as long as you need. Martha's voice carried a finality that didn't invite argument. She pulled a second key from her apron pocket, a newer one, attached to a leather fob. Front door deadbolt. Lock up when you come in. I don't wait up anymore. Thank you, Martha. She waved a hand, dismissing my gratitude like smoke. Breakfast at 7 if you want it. I make oatmeal on Tuesdays. What day is it? Tuesday. I almost laughed. Of course it was. The walk to room 7 was shorter than I remembered. 16 years had compressed the distance, or maybe I'd just grown. The gravel crunched under my boots, and the night air carried the thin scent of sage and dust that had always clung to this valley. The motel's L-shaped layout faced the parking lot, 12 doors in total, 6 on each side. Room 7 sat at the far end, the corner unit, farther. St from the office. I stopped in front of the door. The paint was fresh, a pale cream instead of the faded yellow I remembered, and the brass numbers gleamed. Someone had replaced the welcome mat, too. It read home in block letters. I fit the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the door swung open. The room smelled of bleach and pine sol. Clean. Sterile. Martha had aired it out recently, scrubbed away whatever traces the last guest had left. The bed was made with military precision, the white sheets tucked tight, a single pillow centered at the head. A chest of drawers stood against the far wall, and a small television sat on the nightstand. The bathroom door was open, revealing a clean sink. And a folded towel. I set my duffel bag on the bed and sat down beside it. For a long moment, I just listened to the silence. The wind rattled the window pane, and somewhere in the distance, a truck downshifted on the highway. This room had been my sanctuary for 10 years. The place where I'd learned to read, to do math, to cry without sound. The place where Martha had tucked me in on nights when I'd woken from nightmares about the woman who'd left me here. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. A water stain spread from the corner in the shape of a continent, somewhere that wasn't here. Sleep didn't come easily. Morning light crept through the gap in the curtains, pale and thin, carrying the promise of another dry day. I'd slept in my clothes, too tired to undress, and woke stiff-necked and disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then the familiarity of the room settled around me like an old coat, uncomfortable, but known. I splashed water on my face in the bathroom, studying my reflection in the mirror. I looked like myself, but older. Lines around my eyes that hadn't been there 4 years ago. A harder set to my jaw. I'd spent my 20s building a life in Portland, building a farm, building something I could call mine. And now I was back in a motel room that still smelled like bleach. The oatmeal Martha offered was waiting in the office, served in a chipped ceramic bowl with a side of canned peaches. She didn't ask questions while I ate, just refilled my coffee and watched the morning news on a small television perched on the counter. A weatherman pointed at a map of the state, promising heat and clear skies. "You going to tell me why you're really here?" Martha asked finally, settling into the chair behind the counter. Her voice was soft, not accusing, but carrying the weight of years. I set down my spoon. I don't know where to start. Start at the beginning. You usually do. The beginning. That was a longer story than either of us had time for. I stared into my coffee cup, watching the dark liquid swirl. The farm didn't work out. Martha didn't react. She just waited. I bought it 4 years ago. A small plot outside Portland. The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I watched Martha's face for any sign of judgment, but she simply nodded and reached for the coffee pot. "You want more?" she asked. "I'm fine." She refilled her own cup anyway, the ceramic mug warming her gnarled fingers. The kitchen clock ticked its steady rhythm. A truck rumbled past on the highway, the sound fading into the morning haze. "I lost everything," I said finally. The confession came out flat, clinical. The farm, the savings, the equipment. All of it. Martha set down the pot. "How?" "Bad soil. I tested it before I bought the land, but the samples came back from one corner of the property. The rest was clay and rock. Nothing grew right. I tried everything, raised beds, soil amendments, cover crops. But I was already in debt from the purchase. The bank called in the loan last spring." I hadn't told anyone the full story. Not Ben, who'd only reached out through brief emails over the years. Not the few friends I'd made in Portland. The failure sat inside me like a stone, smooth and heavy and impossible to dislodge. "I'm sorry, Clara." Martha's voice was soft. "I know how hard you worked. I thought if I could just make it work, I'd finally have something that was mine. Something nobody could take away." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Instead, I ended up back here. The one place I swore I'd never return to. Martha didn't flinch. She'd never been the type to take offense where none was intended. "You came back because you needed to." "I came back because I had nowhere else to go." "That's the same thing, child." I opened my mouth to argue, but she was already rising from her chair. Her joints cracked as she straightened, and she crossed to the narrow counter by the window where a stack of mail sat. She rifled through it with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd sorted envelopes every morning for 40 years. "Something came for you," she said. My heart stopped. "For me? Nobody knows I'm here." Martha pulled a cream-colored envelope from the stack and held it out to me. The paper was thick, expensive-looking. My name was written on the front in elegant cursive script: Clara Bennett, care of Sunset Motel, 1427, Highway 9, Ridgecrest, Oregon. I stared at it like it might bite me. "Who sent that?" "Look at the return address." I took the envelope from her. The postmark was from Portland, but that wasn't what made my throat tighten. The return address in the corner read, Victoria Ashford, 472, Pine Terrace, Portland, Oregon. My mother. I hadn't seen that name on a piece of paper in 16 years. Hadn't spoken it aloud in half that long. I turned the envelope over in my hands, running my thumb across the embossed lettering. The paper felt like a foreign object, something from another world. "She must have found out you were back," Martha said carefully. She remained standing, giving me space without leaving the room. "It arrived yesterday, special delivery." "Yesterday? Before I even got here?" I shook my head. "How did she know?" Martha made a noncommittal sound. "The Ashfords have always had resources." I set the envelope on the table as if it were contaminated. "I'm not opening it." "You don't have to. But it came here, so I thought you should know." Martha returned to her chair, settling into it with a soft groan. "You don't owe her anything, Clara. I want you to remember that." "Then why are you giving this to me?" "Because hiding from the truth never did anyone any good." She met my eyes, and something passed between us, an understanding that went deeper than words. "You came back here to face something. Maybe this letter is part of it." I looked down at the envelope. The handwriting was flawless, perfectly spaced, nothing like the messy scrawl I'd used since childhood. Victoria Ashford had always been meticulous about appearances. A letter would be no different. "Did you read it?" I asked. "I wouldn't do that." "So you don't know what it says?" "I know what it likely says." Martha's voice carried a tired edge. "Your mother is a clever woman, Clara. If she's reaching out now, after all these years, she wants something. The question is whether you're willing to give it to her. I pushed the envelope across the table. I'm not. Then throw it away. Burn it. Do whatever you need to do. Martha sipped her coffee. But don't pretend it doesn't exist. That's the easy way out, and you've never taken the easy path. Clara Bennett remains the central figure of this chapter. The kitchen fell silent. The envelope sat between us like a living thing, breathing its own quiet rhythm. I stared at it, cream-colored, expensive, my mother's name embossed in the corner, and felt the weight of 16 years pressing down on my chest. Martha didn't push it back toward me. She simply left it there, a patient monument to everything I'd spent 2 decades running from. I need air, I said. I stood so fast the chair scraped against the linoleum. Martha nodded once, her face unreadable, and I was out the back door before she could say another word. The morning hit me cold and clean. The sun had burned off the last of the fog, and the gravel lot behind the motel glittered with moisture. Beyond the fence line, the field stretched out, acres of dormant grass and wild weeds, bordered by a thin row of oaks that marked where the Sullivan property ended and the national forest began. I'd played in that field as a child. Hidden in those trees when the world got too loud. The memories were fragmented, hazy at the edges, but the geography of this place was etched into my bones. I walked. The grass was wet past my ankles, soaking through my jeans within minutes. I didn't care. Each step felt like a small rebellion against the envelope waiting on that kitchen table, against the name embossed on its corner, against the woman who'd given me life and then left me to survive on my own. The field dipped into a shallow ravine I'd forgotten existed. At the bottom, a creek cut through the red clay, barely 6 inches deep but running clear. I stopped at the edge, watching the water slide over rocks worn smooth by decades of patience. This was the same soil that had betrayed me in Portland. Clay. Rock. Drainage so poor it turned every rain into a flood. I'd spent 3 years fighting that land, believing I could force it to yield, believing hard work could overcome nature. And the land had broken me, quietly and completely, one failed crop at a time. I knelt down and pressed my palm into the wet earth. The cold bit into my skin, sharp and honest. I scooped up a handful, letting the water drain through my fingers, feeling the grit settle into the lines of my palm. Roots need good soil. That was the first lesson I'd learned as a farmer, and the hardest one to accept. You can't plant hope in ground that won't hold it. I'd tried. God, I'd tried. But maybe the problem wasn't the soil. Maybe the problem was what I'd been trying to grow. I stayed by the creek until my knees ached and my fingers were numb. Then I stood, brushed the mud from my jeans, and walked back toward the motel. Martha was on the back porch, sitting in one of the old wooden chairs with a steaming cup of coffee. She'd wrapped a knitted shawl around her shoulders, and her white hair caught the morning light like spun silver. She didn't say anything as I approached, just watched me with those knowing eyes that had seen every version of me, the crying girl, the angry teenager, the woman who'd left without look. Back. I climbed the porch steps and sat in the chair beside her. The creek's still here, I said. It's been here longer than either of us. It'll be here after we're gone. I stared at my hands. Dirt caked under my nails, red as rust. I used to dig in that mud when I was little. I'd make these little forts with sticks and leaves. Pretend I was building something permanent. You built plenty of those. Martha's voice was soft, almost distant. I still have a few, in a box somewhere. Dried out and crumbling, but I couldn't throw them away. I looked at her. Why didn't you ever tell me about my mother? About who she was, what she did? Martha was quiet for a long moment. The coffee cup trembled in her hands, just slightly, the way it always did now. I thought about it. Every year, every birthday, every night you cried yourself to sleep. I thought about telling you everything. But you were a child, Clara. What good would it have done, to know that the woman who left you here was rich and powerful and had chosen to throw you away. Like garbage? Clara Bennett remains the central figure of this chapter. I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, Martha's words still hanging in the air between us. Land. She had given me land. The word felt foreign, too large to fit inside my chest. Land where? I finally managed. My voice came out thin, nothing like the steady tone I'd been practicing since I pulled into the lot. Martha set down her coffee cup and crossed to the window, her arthritic fingers pressing against the glass. She nodded toward the driveway where the unfamiliar car had parked, a dusty blue pickup truck I didn't recognize. That's Ben, she said quietly, as if the name needed no explanation. Ben. Ben Thompson. The name surfaced from somewhere deep, bringing with it the ghost of a gangly teenage boy who used to leave wildflowers on the hood of my car. I hadn't thought about him in years. He's been looking after the property, Martha continued, turning back to face me. Ever since the letter came. I called him when I knew you were coming. You knew I was coming before I arrived? Martha's silence was answer enough. The front door of the motel office creaked open, and I heard boots crossing the worn linoleum of the lobby. A moment later, a man appeared in the kitchen doorway, filling the frame with shoulders that had broadened considerably since I'd last seen him. Ben Thompson's face had weathered into something handsome and solid, lined at the corners of his eyes from years in the sun. His hair had gone most gray, but his eyes were the same warm brown I remembered. Clara. He said my name like he'd been saving it. Ben. I gripped the edge of the counter, steadying myself. I didn't expect. Figured you might show up sooner or later. He pulled off a worn baseball cap and ran a hand through his hair. Martha said you'd need to see the place. What place? Ben and Martha exchanged a look that spoke of conversations I hadn't been part of. A whole history of them, probably, stretching back through the years I'd been gone. The Ashford property, Ben said. About 40 acres, maybe half a mile east of here. Creek runs through the southern edge, good water table. Been sitting empty for as long as I can remember. I blinked. 40 acres? Prime land, Martha added, her voice carrying a weight I didn't understand. Your mother's family owned it for 3 generations. Never developed it, never sold it. Just let it sit. The implications were slow to surface, like bubbles rising through mud. My mother, the woman who had left me at a rundown motel when I was 6 years old, had been sitting on 40 acres of undeveloped land less than a mile from where I'd spent my childhood. Land she had never mentioned, never used, never given me until now. Why? The word came out sharper than I intended. Martha's face softened. That's a question only she can answer, Clara. Then why not just say it in her letter? Why all the mystery, the special delivery, Because she wants you to come to her. Ben's voice was gentle, but the truth in it cut deep. She wants you to need her enough to make the first move. I turned away from both of them, staring out the window at the empty highway. The familiar Oregon landscape stretched toward the horizon, all rolling hills and patient pines. Somewhere out there, 40 acres of land I supposedly owned sat waiting for me to claim it. I want to see it. Martha nodded, as if she'd been expecting this. Ben can take you. I'd come, but my hips won't handle the walk to the back field. Now? Ben asked me. Now. The afternoon sun had climbed higher by the time we left the motel, bleaching the sky to a pale, cloudless blue. Ben led me past the last of the motel cabins and onto a dirt track that wound through a thicket of oak and madrona. The path was narrow enough that we walked single file, his boots crunching on dried leaves and pine needles. This used to be a logging road, he said over his shoulder. Been reclaimed pretty good. I cleared it back a few months ago when Martha told me to start getting the place ready. You've been maintaining it? Just keeping the brush down. Making sure the fences hold. He paused, turning to face me. Martha's been paying me out of her own pocket. Said it was important the land didn't go to waste. I didn't know what to say to that. Martha had never mentioned any of this, not once in all the phone calls and letters we'd exchanged over the years. She had kept this secret locked away, waiting for the right moment. The trail opened suddenly into a clearing, and I stopped breathing. The land stretched before me in a gentle bowl, cupped by low hills on three sides. Clara Bennett remains the central figure of this chapter. I stepped forward before the silence could swallow us whole. The grass crunched under my boots, brittle with frost. Ben didn't move behind me. He gave me space, and I was grateful for it. The land opened like a cupped hand, the low hills curving inward as if they had been waiting for someone to step into their palm. "It's December," I said, not turning around. "Everything's dead or dormant. I can't tell what I'm looking at." "You can tell more than you think," Ben said. His voice carried the easy patience of a man who had learned to read quiet places. "Look past the brown. See the shape of it. The way the hills funnel the wind, that's good for certain crops, bad for others. The creek runs along the south edge, full year round. Martha had me dig a test hole last spring. Soil goes dark about 18 inches down. Rich." I knelt, pressing my palm against the cold earth. It felt like any other dirt. But Ben's words planted something in me that I couldn't shake. "You've been maintaining this for a year," I said. "Martha paid you out of her own pocket." "Why?" "Because she asked." He shrugged, the motion barely visible in my peripheral vision. "And because it didn't feel right letting good land go to seed. Someone should have been caring for it." I stood, brushing dirt from my jeans. She knew I was coming back before I knew it myself. "How is that possible?" "You'd have to ask Martha." Ben's tone was careful, measured. "But I've known her my whole life." "She doesn't guess. She knows." The wind picked up, cutting through my jacket. I pulled the collar tighter and started walking toward the center of the bowl. The ground rose and fell in gentle swells, and I could feel it in my calves, the unfamiliar incline of a place I had never stood on but that was somehow mine. Mine. The word felt foreign in my mouth, unearned. Ben caught up in a few long strides. "There's an old foundation about 200 yards in. Nothing left but the stones. Martha said there used to be a cabin here, back when her grandmother was a girl." I stopped. "Her grandmother?" "Ashford land goes back 3 generations. Never sold, never subdivided. Your mother inherited it from her father, and he inherited it from his." He paused. "Martha's family worked this land once. Before the Ashfords got too big to need hired help." The pieces clicked together slowly, like a lock I had never known existed. Martha Sullivan, keeper of the Sunset Motel, keeper of my childhood, keeper of secrets, and her family had worked my mother's land. That was the thread. That was how she knew. I wanted to ask more, but the foundation came into view ahead. A rectangle of moss-covered stones, half sunken into the earth, marking where someone had once built a life. I walked to its edge and stood where a door might have been. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this," I said. The confession slipped out before I could stop it. "I spent 10 years trying to make dead soil grow things in Portland. I lost everything. My savings, my dignity, my sense of myself. And now I'm standing on 40 acres of land that's been held for me like some kind of inheritance I never asked for. What does she want from me?" "Maybe nothing," Ben said. "Maybe everything. But I don't think this is about what Victoria Ashford wants. I think it's about what you want." I turned to face him. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held the same quiet steadiness I remembered from high school. Ben Thompson had always been the kind of person who showed up without being asked and left without needing thanks. "What do you want?" he asked. I looked back at the stones. The question was simple, but the answer felt like something I'd have to dig for. We walked the full perimeter before the sun started to sink. Ben showed me where the creek ran clear and cold, where the soil deepened, where the hills provided natural windbreaks. He pointed out deer trails and rabbit runs, the skeleton of an apple tree someone had planted decades ago that had gone wild and survived anyway. By the time we reached the motel's gravel lot, my legs ached and my nose was numb. But something had shifted inside me. A small crack in the wall I had built around the idea of this place. Martha was waiting in the kitchen when I came through the back door. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, and the smell of beef and rosemary wrapped around me like a welcome I didn't deserve. "Well," she said, not looking up from the bread she was slicing. "It's land," I said. Clara Bennett remains the central figure of this chapter. Ben lingered in the doorway for a moment, then nodded once and stepped back into the twilight. I watched his outline dissolve into the darkness between the motel's security lights, his footsteps fading until the only sound was the crickets and the soft hum of the fluorescent sign over the office, "Vacancy." Martha turned back to the stove. She lifted the lid of the pot and stirred, releasing a fresh wave of steam that fogged the kitchen windows. "Sit," she said. "You look like you've been dragged through a hedge backwards." I didn't argue. My legs folded beneath me and I dropped into the chair at the scarred wooden table. The same chair I'd sat in 1,000 times as a girl, doing homework I barely understood, eating meals I took for granted. The wood had worn smooth under my elbows over 10 years. I ran my fingers along the edge and felt the familiar groove. "It's not just land," I said. Martha didn't turn around. "I know." "Then why didn't you tell me what it looked like? What it felt like?" She ladled stew into 2 bowls and carried them to the table. The ceramic was warm when she set it in front of me, the broth dark and rich with carrots and potatoes. "Some things," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "you have to discover for yourself. If I'd described it, you'd have built a picture in your head. And then the real thing would never match. That's how disappointment RKS." I picked up my spoon and let it hover over the bowl. "There's a foundation out there. An old stone one, about halfway up the eastern slope. Ben said it's been there for decades." Martha's hand paused over her own spoon. For a second, something flickered behind her eyes. Then she took a slow breath and dipped her spoon into the stew. "That would be the old Ashford homestead. My grandmother's mother lived there when she worked the property. Back when the Ashfords had enough money to hire help but not enough to build something grand." "Your family lived there?" "Lived and worked. 3 generations of Sullivans broke their backs on that land. My grandmother used to tell me stories about hauling water from the creek in winter, about the way frost would creep through the cracks in the stone walls." She lifted her spoon to her mouth, blew on the steam, and took a sip. "She died when I was 12. The house fell apart after that. Nobody had a reason to keep it standing. I thought about the foundation stones, how they'd been arranged with care, how they'd outlived the people who placed them. Why didn't anyone tear it down? The Ashfords didn't care enough to bother, and we didn't have the right." Martha set down her spoon and fixed me with those pale blue eyes that had seen through every lie I'd ever told. "The land belonged to them. The house belonged to them. Even the memories belonged to them, in a way. We were just passing through. Like me." She blinked. "That's different." "Is it?" I pushed the stew around my bowl, watching the vegetables swirl in the broth. "I lived here 10 years. I slept in that room, ate at this table, walked those trails. And I left like it meant nothing. Like I was passing through." "You were 16, Clara. What were you supposed to do? Stay forever?" "I don't know." I set the spoon down. "I don't know what I was supposed to do then, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." The kitchen fell silent. The clock on the wall ticked its steady rhythm. Somewhere in the motel, a pipe groaned. Martha reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was papery and warm, her knuckles swollen with age. "You don't have to know tonight," she said. "You don't have to know tomorrow. But you do have to eat." I picked up the spoon and took a bite. The stew was good. Rich and savory, the meat falling apart, the carrots soft and sweet. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until the warmth hit my stomach. I ate the whole bowl without looking up. Martha watched me in silence. When I finished, she took the bowl and refilled it without asking. I ate that one slower, savoring each bite, letting the heat spread through my chest. "Tell me about the rest of the land," I said between spoonfuls. Martha leaned back in her chair. The kitchen light caught the silver in her hair, turning it into a halo. "What do you want to know?" "The trees. The soil. Ben said there's good earth 18 inches down. That there's a creek that runs year-round. But he didn't tell me why it matters." "Because you already know why it matters. You just don't want to say it out loud." She folded her hands on the table. "That's good soil, Clara. Not perfect. But good." Clara Bennett remains the central figure of this chapter. The words hung in the air between us, unfinished but complete. "You just don't want to say it out loud." Martha's hands remained folded on the table, her silver hair catching the kitchen light like a blessing I hadn't earned. I stared at the grain of the wooden table, tracing a crack with my fingertip. "Good soil," I repeated. "Not perfect. But good. That's all anyone gets, Clara. Perfect is a lie people tell themselves so they don't have to try." The kitchen clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a car door thumped shut. I ignored it. "I walked that land today," I said. Felt the ground under my boots. Saw the creek. The way the hills cup everything like a bowl. And I kept thinking, this isn't mine. It can't be mine. I don't deserve it. Deserve has nothing to do with what's given. Then what does? Martha pushed back from the table and stood. Her joints cracked in protest, but she waved off my instinct to help. "I'll get us more coffee. And then I think you need to hear the rest." "The rest of what?" She didn't answer. She just crossed to the counter, measured grounds into the old percolator, and flipped the switch. The machine began its wheeze and gurgle, filling the kitchen with the scent of something familiar and painful. I watched her work. The careful economy of her movements. The way she kept her back to me, shoulders curved like she was holding something in. "Martha. What aren't you telling me?" She turned, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something I couldn't name. Not pity. Not fear. Something older. "Your mother called yesterday," she said. "After you went to the land." The words landed like stones in my chest. "She called here?" "She wanted to know if you'd arrived. If you'd opened her letter." "Did you tell her I was here?" "I told her you were safe." Martha poured the coffee, steam curling between us. "She said she'd be coming to see you." I didn't think it would be this soon. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. "Coming here? When?" The knock at the kitchen door answered before Martha could. 3 sharp raps. Formal. Insistent. I didn't move. Couldn't. My hands stayed flat on the table, palms down, as if I could anchor myself to the wood and refuse whatever was waiting on the other side. Martha set the coffee pot down with a heavy clunk. "Clara. Don't." My voice came out thin. "Don't tell me to be calm. Don't tell me this is a good thing." I wasn't going to say either of those things. The knock came again. Harder this time. I stood. My legs felt foreign, disconnected from the rest of me. The kitchen had shrunk to the size of a closet, the walls pressing in. I could hear the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. "Let me," Martha said, but I was already moving toward the door. I pulled it open. The woman on the porch had the same bone structure I'd seen in the mirror my whole life. High cheekbones. A straight nose. Eyes the color of winter sky. Victoria Ashford stood in the fading afternoon light like she'd stepped out of a photograph I'd never been allowed to keep. She wore a cream-colored blouse and tailored slacks, every inch of her polished and controlled. Behind her, a silver sedan gleamed in the motel parking lot. Clara. Her voice was exactly as I remembered. Cool. Measured. The voice of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. I said nothing. You look well, she continued, as if this were a social call. As if 16 years hadn't passed. As if she hadn't left me here when I was 6 years old. Martha. I heard Lydia's voice from behind Victoria. My younger sister stepped around our mother, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, a nervous smile flickering across her face. It's good to see you again. Martha nodded from the kitchen doorway. Lydia. We stood there. For women connected by blood and silence. The gap between us felt wider than the porch could hold. Aren't you going to invite us in? Victoria asked. No, I said. The word hung in the air like a slap. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened. I see you've inherited your father's stubbornness. Is that what we're calling it? Lydia shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we could all sit down? Talk like adults? I looked at her. My sister. The child who had grown up with birthday parties and horseback riding lessons and a mother who tucked her in at night. The child who had never been left at a motel with nothing but the clothes on her back. Talk about what? I asked. Clara Bennett remains the central figure of this chapter. The silence stretched between us like a physical thing, thick enough to taste. Victoria stood on the other side of the threshold, her cashmere coat unbuttoned despite the evening chill, one hand resting on the doorframe as if she owned it. Maybe she thought she did. I'm not coming in, I said again, my voice flat. And neither are you. Victoria's lips pressed together in a thin line. For a moment I saw something flicker behind those winter-gray eyes, annoyance, maybe, or calculation. Then it was gone, replaced by the same composed mask she'd worn when I was 6 years old and she'd driven away from this very motel without looking back. Clara. She said my name like it cost her something. I didn't drive all this way to argue on a doorstep. There are things we need to discuss. Important things. Then discuss them from there. Lydia shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her leather jacket rustling. Clara, please. Mom's been. Don't. I held up a hand. Don't stand there and tell me what she's been. You don't get to do that. You don't get to show up after 16 years and act like any of this is normal. I know it's not normal. Lydia's voice cracked slightly. I know that. But she's sick, Clara. She needs. Sick? The word came out sharper than I intended. I looked past Lydia, past the silver sedan gleaming in the parking lot lights, and fixed my gaze on Victoria. Is that why you're here? Because you're sick. Victoria didn't flinch. I have a rare blood disorder. Myelodysplastic syndrome. My bone marrow is failing. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. I felt them hit, felt the ripples spread through my chest, but I didn't let it show on my face. I kept my arms crossed, my jaw tight. And I need a bone marrow transplant. Victoria's voice remained steady, clinical almost. I've been on the registry for 18 months. No matches. The doctors say a biological child is my best chance. The air left my lungs. Not dramatically, I didn't stagger or gasp, but I felt it go, felt the hollow space it left behind. She hadn't come to apologize. She hadn't come to explain. She'd come because she needed something from me. You need my bone marrow. Yes. That's why you sent the letter. That's why you gave me the land. Victoria's chin lifted slightly. The land was always yours. I put it in trust when you turned 18. The letter was an attempt to open communication. I knew you might not respond to a direct request, so I thought if I gave you something first. Something. I laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. You gave me something. A piece of land you didn't want, that had been sitting empty for decades, and you called it a gift. Meanwhile, you've been sitting in Portland, knowing exactly where I was, knowing how to reach me, and you waited until you needed my body to show up in person. That's not. Isn't it? Clara Bennett remains the central figure of this chapter. The knock came soft against the door, 2 taps, a pause, then 2 more. Martha's rhythm, the same pattern she'd used 16 years ago when checking on me after nightmares. I didn't turn from the window. Outside, the last smear of orange bled into violet along the horizon. The silver car had been gone 10 minutes now, long enough for the dust it kicked up to settle back onto the gravel lot. Long enough for the cold knot in my chest to harden into something solid and unfeeling. Clara? The door handle turned. Martha stepped inside without waiting for an answer, the way she always had. I heard the soft creak of the floorboards as she crossed to the foot of the bed. You don't have to say anything, she said quietly. I just wanted to make sure you're all right. I laughed at that, a dry, hollow sound. All right. That's a good word for it. You want to talk? No. I pressed my palms flat against the window frame. Yes. I don't know. The silence stretched between us, comfortable in its familiarity. Martha had never pushed me for words when I wasn't ready. She'd learned that lesson early, back when I was 6 and refused to speak for 3 days after she found me on her doorstep. She'd left food by my door and waited. Eventually, the words came. Tonight, they came before I was ready. She's dying. The words scraped out of me, raw and strangely unburdened. My mother is dying. MDS. Myelodysplastic syndrome. She needs a bone marrow transplant, and I'm her best match because I'm apparently the only legitimate child she ever bothered to check the blood type of. Martha was silent behind me. I could feel her stillness, years of practice and waiting. She knew, Martha. My voice cracked on the word. She knew where I was this whole time. Every single year. She knew about Portland. She knew about the farm. She put that land in trust for me when I turned 18, and she never said a word. She just watched. Waited. Until she needed something from me. I heard the bed springs groan softly as Martha sat down. What are you going to do? That was it. No advice, no judgment, no hidden meaning. Just the question I'd been turning over in my mind since Victoria had driven away with her accomplice daughter trailing behind. I don't know. Yes, you do. I turned from the window. Martha sat on the edge of my bed, her hands folded in her lap, her gray eyes fixed on me with that steady, unnerving clarity she'd always possessed. She looked older than she had when I arrived 3 days ago. The confrontation on her doorstep had taken something out of her, too. What's that supposed to mean? It means you've already decided. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet. She patted the bed beside her. Come sit. You're standing by that window like a sentinel isn't helping anything. I didn't want to sit. Every muscle in my body felt wound-tight, spring-loaded for flight. But Martha's voice had that quality it always did, a pull I couldn't resist, even after all these years. I sat. Clara, I've known you since you were this high. She held her hand at waist level. I've watched you cry over scraped knees and broken friendships and the first time a boy broke your heart. You're a runner. Always have been. But you're not the kind of runner who runs from things forever. You run to gain distance, to see the shape of what's chasing you. Then you turn around and face it. Maybe this time I should keep running. Would that make you feel better? I had no answer. She knew it. She wants me to get tested tomorrow morning, I said. Blood type match. They can do it at the clinic in town. And you said you'd consider it. I said I'd think about it. Same thing, coming from you. Martha's hand found mine, papery and warm. I'm not going to tell you what to do. That's not my place. But I do want you to ask yourself one question. Just one? Just one. She squeezed my fingers. If you say no, if you walk away, if you get in your car tonight and drive back to Portland, will you still be able to look yourself in the mirror tomorrow morning? Not because of what she wants. Because of who you are. The words landed like stones in my chest. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Not what Victoria deserved. Not what Lydia expected. Not what Martha hoped. What I could live with. She abandoned me. The words came out sharp, a blade I'd been sharpening for 16 years. She left me on your doorstep like a package she didn't want, and she never looked back. Not once. Not a phone call, not a letter, not a single attempt to explain why. And now she shows up because she's sick, and Clara Bennett remains the central figure of this chapter. The silence in room 7 stretched long after Martha's footsteps faded down the hall. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands still clasped between my knees, staring at the worn floral pattern of the curtain. The weight of my own words hung in the air. I'll do it. I'll go to the clinic tomorrow. They felt foreign now, as if someone else had spoken them. I lay back on the bed, the springs groaning under my weight. The ceiling had the same water stain I remembered from childhood, a pale brown bloom shaped vaguely like a hand. I'd stared at it 1,000 nights, imagining it reaching down, offering something I couldn't name. Now it just looked like decay. Sleep didn't come easily. Each time I closed my eyes, Victoria's face appeared, those winter gray eyes, the set of her jaw, the way she'd held herself like a woman who had never apologized for anything. And Lydia, standing just behind her shoulder, smaller than I remembered, her expression a nod of discomfort and something else. Something that looked almost like pleading. I must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the curtain. A soft knock came at the door. Clara? Martha's voice, gentle but firm. It's almost 8. If you still want to go to the clinic, we should head over before Dr. Harmon gets busy. I sat up, my neck stiff from sleeping in my clothes. For a moment, the previous night felt like a dream, Victoria's confession, Martha's quiet challenge, my own reluctant surrender. But the hollow in my chest told me it was real. I'm coming, I called, my voice rough with sleep. I washed my face in the small bathroom, avoiding my reflection in the mirror. The woman I saw there looked tired, uncertain, caught between two versions of herself, the one who had run from everything, and the one who had agreed to walk back into the fire. Martha had coffee waiting in the kitchen, along with toast and a small bowl of peaches. She didn't press conversation. We ate in a silence that felt more like a held breath, the ticking of the wall clock marking the minutes. I called the clinic, Martha said as I finished my coffee. Dr. Harmon can see us at 9:30. It's just a blood draw for the typing. Simple procedure. I know what it is. The words came out sharper than I intended. I softened my voice. Sorry. I know you're trying to help. Martha's eyes held mine. I'm not going to tell you this is the right decision or the wrong one. I'm just going to be here either way. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The drive to town took 10 minutes. Martha's old pickup rattled over the gravel roads, the morning sun casting long shadows across fields still wet with dew. I watched the landscape scroll past, farms, fences, an occasional cluster of mailboxes at a crossroads. This was the country I'd grown up in, the country I'd left and never expected to see again. And yet here I was, riding toward a clinic to Eve blood for a woman who had abandoned me. The clinic was a low brick building on Main Street, flanked by a hardware store and a diner. A brass plaque beside the door read Dr. Harmon, Family Medicine, EST 1978. Martha held the door for me, and we stepped into a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and old magazines. A nurse with silver-streaked hair looked up from the reception desk. Martha? Good to see you. And this must be Clara. I blinked. You remember me? The nurse smiled. I'm Sarah. I was a few years ahead of you in school. You probably don't remember me, I was quiet back then. But I heard you were back in town. News traveled fast in a small place. I wondered what else Sarah had heard, but I didn't ask. Dr. Harmon was a round-bellied man in his 60s with a calm, unhurried manner. He shook my hand, asked a few routine questions about my medical history, and explained the blood typing process. It would take about 48 hours for the results. If you're a match, he said, we'll need to do further testing to confirm compatibility. The full workup is more involved. But let's start with this. I rolled up my sleeve and let the needle slide into my arm. The blood filled 2 small vials, dark and warm. I watched it as if it belonged to someone else. When it was done, Sarah labeled the vials and placed them in a refrigerated cabinet. We'll call you as soon as we have results, she said. Probably by the day after tomorrow. I thanked her, and Martha and I walked back to the pickup. The morning had warmed, the sun climbing higher, but I felt cold. That wasn't so bad, Martha said as she started the engine. No. It wasn't. The pickup's engine idled rough, the old engine ticking as it cooled. I stared through the windshield at the motel's faded sign, the word Sunset barely legible against the afternoon sky. My arm still stung where the needle had gone in. I could use some air, I said. Martha turned off the engine. There's the fair. I looked at her. What? The Harvest Fair. It's today. Started this morning, runs till sundown. She pulled the keys from the ignition and shifted in her seat to face me. Town Square. They've been setting up since Tuesday. Pumpkin contest, apple cider, quilts. The whole thing. I remembered. Every October, the last Saturday before Halloween. As a kid, I'd gone twice with Martha, the first time holding her hand so tight my fingers ached. The second time I'd been 11 and too old for it, or so I'd thought. The smell of fried dough and hay bales came back to me like a half-forgotten song. I don't think I'm in the mood for a fair, Martha. That's exactly why you should go. I pressed my palm against the cold glass of the window. People will look at me. Sarah's already telling everyone about the blood draw. Let them look. They'd look anyway. Martha's voice was gentle but firm. You can't hide in that room for 2 days waiting for a phone call. Trust me, I've done plenty of waiting in my life. It doesn't get easier in a dark room. I wanted to argue. Every fiber of me wanted to climb into bed, pull the covers over my head, and exist in that suspended state between action and consequence. But she was right. I knew she was right. The stillness would crush me. Fine, I said. But I'm not buying a pumpkin. Martha smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. Nobody's asking you to. We climbed out of the pickup, and I followed her into the motel office. The bell above the door chimed, and Ben straightened from where he'd been leaning against the kitchen counter. He held a coffee mug in his hands, the same chipped ceramic one from breakfast. You're back, he said. His eyes moved from Martha to me, assessing. Everything go okay? It's done, I said. Now we wait. He nodded, not pressing for details. I appreciated that about him. He didn't fill silence with questions that had no answers. The fair's on, Martha said, moving past him into the kitchen. I'm going to grab a jacket and we'll head over. Ben, you want to come? He looked at me. If Clara doesn't mind company. I shrugged. The gesture felt hollow, but it was all I had. It's a free country. Ben set down his mug and walked to the door. I'll drive us. The truck still got half a tank. The square was 3 blocks east, and I could hear it before I saw it, a low buzz of laughter and chatter, the squeal of a child, the tinny calliope music of a carousel that had been making rounds since before I was born. The street was blocked off with wooden barricades, and clusters of people moved between white tents and folding tables draped in red-checked cloth. Ben found parking on a side street, and we walked the rest of the way. Martha took the lead, her pace steady despite her age. She knew everyone, or everyone knew her. We hadn't gone 10 feet before a woman in a quilted vest called out to her. "Martha. Glad you made it. Is that Clara Bennett?" The woman's face was round and florid, her gray hair pinned back with a plastic clip. I didn't recognize her, but she spoke as if we'd met yesterday. "It is," Martha said. "She's back for a visit." The woman's eyes flickered with something, curiosity, recognition, maybe both. "Well, welcome back, Clara. I'm Doris Hember. I used to work the register at the hardware store. You probably don't remember me." "I remember the store," I said, which was true. The hardware store had smelled of sawdust and oil, and the owner, a man named Mr. Gable, had given me a piece of candy every time I came in with Martha. "You look well," Doris said, though the words carried the weight of a question. "Thank you." We moved on, and I felt her gaze linger on my back. The rumors were already spreading. Sarah the nurse had probably called 3 people before my blood was even labeled. The fair unfolded ahead of us in a familiar pattern. Hay bales stacked against the old bandstand. A row of tables with jars of honey and apple butter. A cider press where a teenage boy worked the crank while his father fed apples into the hopper. The smell of frying dough wrapped around me, and despite myself, my stomach turned. "Hungry?" Ben asked. "Not yet." Clara Bennett remains the central figure of this chapter. The apple cider was warm in my hands, the heat seeping through the paper cup and into my palms. I stared at the surface, at the steam curling upward, at the tiny flecks of cinnamon floating in the amber liquid. Around me, the harvest festival continued its steady rhythm of laughter and chatter and the occasional shriek from a child winning a game. Ben stood beside me, his own cup untouched. He wasn't watching the crowd. He was watching me. "You're going to burn your hands," he said. I looked down. My knuckles were white around the cup. I loosened my grip, and the blood rushed back into my fingers in a prickling wave. "I'm fine," I said. "You've said that 3 times in the last 10 minutes. Then maybe it's starting to be true." He didn't argue. He just took a sip of his cider and let the silence settle between us. I appreciated that about him. He never pushed. He was simply there, solid and unmovable, like the old oak tree that stood at the edge of the fairgrounds. Martha had wandered over to a stall selling hand-knitted scarves, her gray head bent in conversation with a woman I didn't recognize. She glanced back at me once, her expression unreadable, then turned back to the scarves. The truth of the courtyard. That was what I needed. But the courtyard was back at the motel, empty and waiting, and I was here, surrounded by people who either knew who I was or were about to find out. "How much longer do you think we need to stay?" I asked Ben. "Until Martha decides we can leave. She's not my keeper." "No," he said, and there was something careful in his voice. "But she's worried about you." "We both are." I didn't know what to say to that. So I said nothing. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the fairgrounds. The lights strung between the stalls flickered on, one by one, their warm glow cutting through the deepening blue of twilight. The air smelled of wood smoke and frying dough and the last stubborn traces of summer. I finished my cider and crushed the cup in my hand. "I need to go back," I said. Ben nodded. "I'll tell Martha." He was gone before I could stop him, weaving through the crowd with a ease that spoke of familiarity. I watched him go, watched the way people nodded to him as he passed, the way they recognized him as someone who belonged here. I had belonged here once. Or I had thought I did. But that was before I knew the truth about why I had been left here, before the questions started stacking up like stones in a wall I couldn't see over. Martha appeared at my elbow, a scarf draped over her arm. "It's starting to get cold," she said, as if that explained everything. "Is it?" "October in the mountains. It gets cold fast after dark." She studied my face. "You want to go back?" "Yes." "Then let's go." We walked in silence, Ben falling into step beside me, the three of us a strange procession through the thinning crowd. The fairgrounds were emptying out, families heading home, teenagers gathering in clusters near the food stalls. A few people called out to Martha, and she waved but didn't stop. The motel was dark when we reached it, the neon sign on the roof humming softly in the gathering dusk. The courtyard stretched between the two wings of the building, a rectangle of cracked concrete surrounded by dying flower beds and a few scraggly bushes. A single light hung above the office door, casting a pool of yellow light across the ground. I stopped at the edge of the courtyard. "This is where she left me," I said. Martha's breath caught. Ben went still beside me. "It was right here," I continued, my voice flat. "I remember. She told me to wait while she checked in. And then she just didn't come back." The memory was sharp and clear, like a photograph I had studied too many times. The cold concrete beneath my legs. The way the light from the office door had pulled around me, making me feel exposed. The sound of a car engine fading into the distance. The long, endless wait. "Clara." Martha's voice was soft. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." I turned to face her. "I've been running from this for 16 years. From this place, from her, from the truth about why she left me here. And I'm tired. I'm so tired of running." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and raw. Martha's eyes glistened in the dim light. "I know," she said. "I know you are." "Then tell me." My voice cracked. "Tell me what you know. You were there. You found me that night. You must have known something. You must have had some idea why she would do this." Clara Bennett remains the central figure of this chapter. The words hung between us like a held breath. Martha's eyes glistened, and for a long moment, I thought she might crumble right there in the cold October air. But instead, she straightened her shoulders, a movement so small I almost missed it, and nodded once. "All right," she said. Her voice came out rough, scraped clean of its usual warmth. "All right, Clara. You deserve that. You've always deserved that." Ben shifted beside me, and I felt his presence like a wall at my back, not pressing, but there. Solid. I hadn't asked him to stay, but he had, and I was grateful for it in a way I couldn't put into words. Martha looked past me, past Ben, to the silver sedan still idling at the edge of the parking lot. Victoria sat in the driver's seat, her silhouette sharp against the glow of the dashboard lights. Lydia was in the passenger seat, her face turned toward us, a pale oval in the darkness. "They should hear this too," Martha said quietly. "Or part of it, at least." I wanted to say no. I wanted to keep this moment for myself, this truth that had been buried for 16 years, that I had earned the right to hear first. But something in Martha's expression stopped me. She wasn't asking permission. She was telling me that the truth was bigger than my anger, bigger than Victoria's lies, bigger than all of us standing in this gravel lot. I turned and walked toward the sedan. My boots crunched on the loose stones, and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. When I reached the driver's side, I didn't knock. I just stood there, arms crossed against the cold, and waited. Victoria's window rolled down with a soft hum. Her face was composed, her hand still on the wheel, but I caught the flicker in her eyes, a flicker that might have been surprise or might have been dread. Lydia leaned forward from the passenger seat, her expression unreadable. "Martha's going to tell me the truth," I said. "About why you left me here. About everything. I thought you should know." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Clara, I don't think." "I didn't ask what you think." My voice was flat, empty of the heat that had driven me all day. "I'm telling you what's happening. You can stay and hear it, or you can drive away. I don't care which." Lydia's fingers curled around the edge of the passenger seat. "I want to stay," she said, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. Victoria shot her a look, something sharp and warning, but Lydia didn't back down. For a moment, the two of them held a silent battle in the dim light of the sedan's interior. Then Victoria cut the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. We gathered in the motel office. Martha's small kitchenette, with its worn linoleum and the pot of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Ben stood by the door, his arms crossed, a silent sentinel. Lydia sat at the small formica table, her hands wrapped around a mug she didn't drink from. Victoria remained standing, her back to the counter, her posture rigid and watchful. I sat across from Lydia, my hands flat on the table, and looked at Martha. "Tell me," I said. Martha took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, a place she hadn't visited in years. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down heavily, like a woman whose bones had suddenly grown tired. "Your mother didn't leave you here by accident," Martha began. Her eyes met mine, and I saw something raw in them, something that looked like guilt. "She brought you here because she knew me. Because she knew I would take you in." I blinked. "You knew her before?" "Not well. But I knew who she was. The Ashford family had owned land in this valley for generations. My grandmother worked for them. My mother grew up in a house that sat on their property." Martha's voice dropped. When Victoria found herself in trouble, when she found herself with a child she didn't want, she remembered that there was a woman in this valley who owed her family a debt. My throat tightened. "What kind of debt?" Martha's hands trembled as she folded them on the table. "A life debt. My mother was hemorrhaging after I was born. There was no doctor within 20 miles, and the snow had cut us off. Victoria's father, your grandfather, rode through that blizzard to bring a midwife. He saved my mother. Saved me." Her voice cracked. "When Victoria showed up on my porch with you in her arms, she held that debt over me like a knife. She said, 'Take my daughter, or my father died for nothing.'" The words settled into the silence between us like stones dropped into still water. I thought of all the years I'd spent wondering why I was here, why Martha had never sent me away. The answer wasn't love, not at first. But as I watched her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand, I understood that duty could grow into something warmer if you let it. She hadn't chosen me out of kindness, but she had chosen to stay. I reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but she squeezed back. Outside, the wind died down, and the first pale light of dawn crept through the kitchen window, washing the countertops in gold. Martha let out a long breath, and for the first time in all my memories, she smiled, not a tired smile, but a free one.